Good afternoon, 8th grade. It is Thursday, April 30th, the last day of the fourth month of the year. I know this year has been kind of strange with what's happened with the coronavirus. I hope everybody in this class is doing well, keeping in contact with friends in any way they can, practicing social distancing so we're all safe. And guys, I know, I wish you guys were here in the classroom so we could cut jokes and all that good stuff. Talking to a camera that can't talk back is kind of boring, but at the same time, it would sort of terrify me if the camera started cutting jokes back. So in a sense, it's a good thing. So we're on Thursday, April 30th. We're going to be reading section 23.2, Reagan's Foreign Policy, 372 to 375. We will not do the section review today. So no section review. But we're going to start on page 372 and we're going to read, standing up against communism and terrorism, strong foreign policy, which was very different than what we had in the 60s and 70s. We had an act of presidents that were weak in their foreign policy, but Reagan was extremely tough on his enemies. As he had promised, President Reagan restored the strength of the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force, enabling the nation to exercise peace through strength. He believed in stopping communism before it could attack and enslave a country, an idea which became known as the Reagan Doctrine. In 1980, the people of Poland began to protest the tyranny of communism in their land. Polish nationalists, calling themselves a Solidarity movement, decided to stand up to the Soviets. In response, the communists declared martial law or military rule in Poland and rounded up members of Solidarity to be imprisoned, tortured, and executed. President Reagan denounced this action and expressed support for Solidarity. Now let's see some things that are going on in Grenada. In 1983, President Reagan learned that the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro planned to take over the island nation of Grenada in the West Indies and use that as a military base to invade the mainland of South America. A small force of Cuban military men had already arrived in Grenada when the Grenadians and other Caribbean islands called on the United States for help. To prevent a full-fledged communist invasion, President Reagan sent American troops to Grenada to defend the people. The Grenadians gratefully welcomed the American soldiers to their island. With the help of the armed forces from neighboring islands, the Americans quickly rounded up the advance guard of Cubans and simply shipped them back to Cuba, saving Grenada and the continent of South America from a communist invasion. There were some things that go on in El Salvador at this time. The Soviets and Cubans continued to stir up rebellion and bloodshed in Central America during the 1980s. In addition to large amounts of military and economic aid, President Reagan sent 50 military advisors to the Central American nation of El Salvador to prevent a communist takeover there. He didn't send military power, but he sent advisors, people who could help the El Salvadorians kind of control their budget, control their military. So we didn't even have to send a military force there. Now let's check out South Korea. In September of 1983, a South Korean passenger airliner apparently strayed into Soviet airspace. The Soviets, claiming it was a spy plane, shot it down, killing 269 people, including 60 Americans. President Reagan announced further defense buildups to combat the communist threat. Now let's see what's going on in Afghanistan. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, American weapons were shipped to Afghanistan to help the freedom fighters there resist Soviet forces. The tide of battle turned against the communists as Afghan freedom fighters began to use American high-tech weapons. In 1986, Stinger missiles, supplied by the CIA, virtually destroyed the Soviets' fleet of combat helicopters. Now let's see what's going on in Libya. Many Muslim terrorists were trained in Libya, where dictator Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi sponsored international terrorism. In 1986, a bomb exploded near an American military base in West Berlin, killing one American soldier and wounding 50 other people. When President Reagan discovered that Gaddafi was behind this and many other attacks, he promptly sent American warplanes to bomb targets in Libya. After the airstrike, the number of terrorist incidents decreased. Iran-Contra. Also in 1986, a group of terrorists supported by Iran seized 6 Americans in Lebanon and held them hostage. President Reagan agreed to sell some arms to the Iranians if they would help release the hostages, and the CIA arranged to use the proceeds to support the Contra freedom fighters in Nicaragua. Meanwhile, Congress decided to negotiate a peace settlement with the communists in Nicaragua and outlawed all help to the Contras. Still concerned about the communist threat in Nicaragua, Colonel Oliver North and others arranged the transfer of Iranian funds to the Contras. The televised Iran-Contra hearings in 1987 investigated these events. The Congressional Investigating Committee said that North had violated the law, but later court trials failed to convict him. And make sure you read this little section on 374 about the information age. It talks about wireless transmissions, the creation of the internet, computers, and other things like that you might find interesting. The INF Treaty. The new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev met with President Reagan in Geneva, Switzerland, and then again in Iceland in 1986 to discuss a mutual limitation of nuclear arms. This resulted in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987. The Soviets had placed medium-range nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe, and the United States had responded in kind by placing missiles in Great Britain and Germany. Under the INF agreement, Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to remove these missiles from Europe. And through all this, the decline of the Soviet Union also happens. The presidency of Ronald Reagan sets into motion a chain of historic events. Under his leadership, America strengthened her defenses and pursued research into space-age technology with renewed vigor. Although the Soviet Union strove desperately to keep up, several obstacles stood in its way. One, the inefficient system of communism itself hindered progress because it gave the people little incentive to work. If the government owns everything, the property, your businesses, what drives you? If you're going to make the same no matter what because the government owns everything, why would you work hard? You wouldn't. Number two, the Soviet government spent so much time and resources building weapons that it couldn't provide basic necessities such as food, shelter, and clothing for its people. Although powerful members of the Communist Party enjoyed a high standard of living, this was not the norm. Many people in communist countries had to use food ration cards every month to get food. And if they ate all the food that their ration card would provide, they were just going to have to starve it out until they got another ration card. And then lastly, the communists also gave vast amounts of aid to terrorist groups around the world, creating severe financial problems within the Soviet Union. Thus, the evil empire, as Ronald Reagan called it, began to collapse. But Reagan faces some challenges though. In 1987, President Reagan visited the city of West Berlin. With the ugly concrete blocks and barbed wire of the Berlin Wall behind it, Reagan addressed a crowd of West German citizens. Motioning toward the wall behind him, the president issued a challenge to the communist leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And he pounded on the Berlin Wall as he did this. It was an angry challenge. This wall was an ugly sight, separating a city. The people on the east side of this city were Germans just as much as those on the west. The only difference was that they were controlled by a communist regime. Reagan knew that America's progress in the development of laser weaponry alarmed Gorbachev. The Soviet leader was especially concerned about a program called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, not the movie. President Reagan had equipped the American military with technological marvels that the bankrupt Soviet Union had no chance in matching. Desperate to save the Soviet Union from complete collapse, Gorbachev agreed, 1, to reduce Soviet weapon strength, 2, to free the enslaved nations of Eastern Europe by allowing them to hold elections to see if they would really want peace, and 3, to stop encouraging revolution and bloodshed throughout the world. In return, the United States and other free nations promised to help the Soviet Union rebuild its economy and political system based on democracy and free capitalist and free enterprise model that they had used. And this plan to the Soviet Union was called perestroika, which means restructuring. The communists also adopted a foreign policy known as glasnost, which means openness, claiming that they wanted world peace and had no plans to conquer other countries. However, conservatives in the United States noted that communist terrorists still continued to receive Soviet aid, but on a reduced scale. The Reagan legacy. As president, there were 3 great things Reagan accomplished. 1, he represented traditional values. Less government regulations of private property occurred under his leadership. And lastly, and most importantly, a return to patriotism and military strength. The president's buildup of American military defenses aided the collapse of the Soviet communism and the Soviet Union, and his support of private enterprise caused an economic boom that further weakened the appeal of communism around the world. Remember, part of the Cold War was to prove that American beliefs, not just its political system, but its economy, was better than the Soviet Union's. And Reagan surely showed the American economy shine. And that's the end of 23.2. Remember, no section review today, guys. I will see you on Friday. Friday's lesson will be short and sweet, so I will see you then. Have a good day.